A recent trend I've been thinking of a lot recently is just how much everyone seems to hate social media. Just searching the words on YouTube pulls up dozens of videos of how it's rotting our brains and ruining society. Which is kind of ironic considering YouTube is a social media platform. And it's not just YouTube. This anti-social media sentiment seems to be everywhere. Entire corners of the internet built around tearing itself down. And yet despite all this backlash, usage has never been higher. Everyone I know who says they hate social media still uses it on a near daily basis. It's like we're trapped in a strange, inescapable love-hate relationship with it. This is what I find so fascinating. Social media has documented negative effects, but there's a ton of vices out there that no one bats an eye at. What is it about social media that's turning people off so much and starting this whole counterculture? I may be one of the least qualified people to answer this, as I've never really had much of a social media presence myself, but after debating with friends, researching online, and just brooding in my cave, I think I know why. The hard part is choosing where to begin, because this didn't actually start with social media. Truthfully, this movement is the result of a long chain reaction that's been building for generations. To understand how we got here, we need to go back nearly a century to one of the worst chapters in American history. On October 24th, 1929, the New York Stock Exchange experienced the worst crash in the nation's history. The day would come to be known as Black Thursday, and it marked the beginning of the long, brutal years of the Great Depression. In the years following, nearly a third of the US's GDP was slashed, a quarter of the population was unemployed, and roughly 9,000 banks had gone out of business. For those who grew up during the crisis, life was hard. Shoes with holes were patched with cardboard. Kids waited in bread lines while their fathers desperately sought work. Some even joined the workforce as young as 8 to help support the family. Experiences like these tend to mold you. People who know hunger don't usually want to gamble their way back into it. Victims of childhood poverty tend to be more risk-averse as adults, generally valuing stability and structure over opulence. This goes hand in hand with a sort of keep your head down and work mentality. There's no time for social justice when you have mouths to feed. This was how the silent generation got their moniker. Unlike other generations, they're characteristically averse to America's favorite pastime of protesting. They prefer to follow the rules and have faith the system will figure things out if they just do their part. Which is ironic considering that the Great Depression was largely due to the government's incompetency. A lot of the financial and social regulation we have today were born out of the disaster. But when you look at it from their perspective, it starts to make more sense. None of the silent generation personally witnessed the stock market crash. They definitely felt the effects of it in their childhood, but they were too young to actually watch it happen. What they did watch was the government pull the nation out of the Depression and lead the US to a global hegemony after the end of World War II. This was to this day the zenith of the US's relative power. The rest of the world's powers were either impoverished or had been bombed to shit in the war. The US alone was perfectly positioned to supply the world with all the goods and services needed to rebuild. And so began the golden age of capitalism. Real wages rose steadily year after year. A typical house cost 2 years' pay, less than half of the historical national average. College was also a fraction of the cost today and was affordable even for working-class Joes. Never before had the American dream with its white picket fences and nuclear families seemed so attainable. At least for white men. But besides that, this picture that we painted, the belief in traditional institutions, hard work, progress, etc., are hallmarks of modernism. Not to be confused with something that's contemporary or happening in our current time period, modernity is a zeitgeist, a cultural vibe that defined the period from the Enlightenment to the mid-20th century. It's hard to pin down a precise definition, as it's not really a movement, but more of a lens through which society views the world. But in general, modernism is defined by its belief in grand narratives and its unwavering confidence in its own values. It champions ideas like justice and progress that it believes are incorruptible and undefeatable. Most early films are inherently modernist, as the medium arose during the time period. One of the best examples, and maybe one of the greatest movies of all time, is the 1957 film 12 Angry Men. The entire movie takes place over the course of a single afternoon, inside one small jury room, where 12 men are tasked with deciding the fate of an 18-year-old boy accused of murdering his father. There's no soundtrack, no flashbacks, and no dramatic cutaways. The tension comes entirely from dialogue, body language, and the slow unraveling of doubt. It's a masterclass in both acting and screenwriting, and still holds up incredibly well today. But after rewatching it recently, it occurred to me just how modernist this movie is. The whole film is a tribute to the core ideals of the American justice system. Characters openly monologue about the importance of civil duty and democracy. But the biggest example of this is the protagonist. Juror number 8, played by Henry Fonda, is the perfect American. He's a soft-spoken, thoughtful family man who calmly stands alone against the outspoken majority because he believes in giving the accused a due process. And in doing so, he convinces the other jurors to reconsider by deducing multiple holes in the prosecution's case that were somehow never discovered at trial. He never loses his temper, never seems unsure of himself, and exudes a quiet strength and unshakable sense of justice. Unlike the rest of the jury, he seems to have absolutely no flaws. The only thing I could think of was that he smoked, but this was the 50s, so it would be lame not to smoke. Like I said, he's the perfect American. Maybe that's why, despite my love for the film, juror number 8 just always felt a little off to me. The rest of the jury seemed like real people you could find in a Manhattan courtroom. But juror number 8 isn't really a person at all. He's more like a symbol. It's as if he was written less of a character and more as an embodiment of justice itself, calmly guiding the others toward enlightenment over the course of the film. He's not just right, he's morally invincible. This type of protagonist is pretty common in modernist films. Characters who stand for truth, duty, or progress, and who inevitably triumph over their enemies. It reflected the American spirit at the time, that the world was theirs for the taking. But as the 60s rolled around, cracks began to form in the once unassailable American dream. The Watergate scandal and Vietnam War shattered the public's faith in the government and its institutions. Add in economic stagnation and rising inequality, and people began to grow disillusioned with the modernist promise. The result was a cultural backlash so strong that it spawned one of the most iconic countercultures in history. The hippie movement, at its core, was a rejection of the traditional values of modernity. Capitalism and industrialism were thrown out in favor of anti-materialism and environmentalism. Marriage, which had been a sacred institution throughout the nation's history, was replaced with open relationships and free love, man. Gender fluidity emerged, psychedelic use was common, everyone had a yoga mat. It was a different time, even by today's standards. And though it started out as a counterculture, it eventually just became the culture. It was so mainstream that a new zeitgeist, a new mood, emerged to define the mid to late 20th century, creatively named Postmodernism. Postmodernism is a rejection of traditional establishments and a tolerance of relativity. Rather than believing in objective truths, postmodernism believes everything is both right and wrong. Nothing is truly absolute, everything is a gray area. Which falls in line with the hippie movement. It definitely championed alternative lifestyles. But in my opinion, there's one thing that kept the hippie movement from being truly postmodern. Hippies still had an authentic optimism that the world was heading in the right direction. Like the modernists, they too saw themselves as instrumental in fighting for a better, albeit very different, future. What postmodernism had that the hippie movement didn't was lots and lots of irony.
I like to teach the world to sing with me.
Throughout the 1950s to 70s, mass media and public marketing underwent massive changes. Gone were the days of blunt advertising that just listed facts about a product. Instead, companies were increasingly shifting to pathos or emotion-based advertising. And in doing so, the focus was shifted away from the physical product or service and towards the feelings they evoked. Brands were becoming personified through symbols and mascots. Never before could one identify with a cheetah wearing sunglasses so much. But what happens when these symbols become more important than the actual things they represent? This is the question that famous postmodern author John Baudrillard proposed. In this state, or hyper-reality as he called it, symbols like the Nike swoosh and Coca-Cola logo become more meaningful to us than the physical product itself. Without the logos, they're just cheap shoes and sugar water. We pay a premium for them because of the values they represent. This idea was groundbreaking. It even inspired the Matrix series. If what we value are just the copies or representations of things, then is there really any originality left in the world? And if that's the case, then how do the generations growing up in a world devoid of meaning cope with that? Well, for millennials and Gen X, the answer was irony. Nowhere was this more obvious than in the rise of parody. Parodies at their core mock originality. By pointing out and subverting all the tropes common to their source material, they expose how cliché and repetitive they really are. In the same way, they can also critique values or themes by over-exaggerating them to alter the connotation. A high school jock could represent classic American values like athleticism and self-confidence, but by cranking his Chad level up to 11, he's now a brainless idiot that lacks subtlety. This is illustrated perfectly in the rise of adult animation in the 80s and 90s. Most of the genre's biggest hits are parodies of the family-friendly sitcoms of the previous generation. At first glance, Family Guy looks like another Jetsons or Flintstones. Each show centers around a quirky nuclear family navigating everyday life, all wrapped up in colorful, lighthearted animation. In fact, you could watch entire scenes of Family Guy and not even know it's for adult audiences. That's how I used to trick my grandmother to let me watch it when I was a kid. But behind the pretty colors and cheerful tone, Family Guy depicts an extremely dysfunctional family. Meg is routinely emotionally and physically abused by her own family. Peter is a selfish, drunken idiot who constantly endangers everyone around him. Brian is a narcissistic douche who masks his selfishness behind a thin facade of sophistication. Every episode ends with someone, usually Peter, apologizing for the awful acts he committed that episode, for all to then be forgiven and everything returned back to normal. There is no lasting character growth. Peter might admit to his mistakes that episode, but he's right back to his usual hijinks in the next one. If this family existed in the real world, the authorities would immediately be involved. And yet it works, because Family Guy keeps the same lighthearted tone of the old sitcoms. No one wants to watch an abusive family in real life, but by altering the tone, it's not only palatable, but funny. At least sometimes. But it's also more than that. The reason Family Guy, and by extension Postmodernism, resonated with audiences so much is by doing what modernism often fails to do, acknowledging the elephant in the room. When young men were being shipped off to die in Vietnam, when crime rates were spiking, when institutions were rotting from within, endlessly chirping about progress starts to sound dystopian. It might seem cold to laugh at tragedy, but sometimes humor is the only way to confront it. In its early days especially, Family Guy gave people a way to process the chaos and disillusionment of the 21st century by laughing through the pain. But emphasis on early days, because as Family Guy became increasingly culturally and commercially successful, it also gradually became uncool. Like, everyone knows about Family Guy, but how many people are actually excited for season 23? And yeah, part of this is probably just creative fatigue after so many seasons, but I think there's an even bigger reason why Family Guy lost its touch. Parodies are by nature critical. They mock and exaggerate the source material to expose its cracks. Like 90% of Family Guy's humor consists of making fun of traditional institutions and mainstream trends. Which is fine, except Family Guy is produced and owned by 20th Century Fox, who in turn is owned by Disney, one of the top media empires in the world. In a sense, the show dunking on Fox and Disney just contributes to the status quo by lining their pockets. Early on, this isn't as pronounced, but at a certain point, all this subversion starts to feel safe and packaged. When Rick and Morty made fun of McDonald's, what did McDonald's do? They brought back Szechuan sauce to extreme commercial demand. Now every company is lining up to get roasted by the show in hopes of creating the same craze. This is when parodying stops becoming cool, when it stops being rebellion and becomes merch. And this isn't just a Family Guy or Rick and Morty problem. The exact same thing happened to social media. Take MySpace, for example. Back in 2003, it was a caricature of the early internet. It was messy, chaotic, and deeply personal. You could log on as Emo Kitten XX and talk about wanting to die XD on your god-awful HTML page. Sure, it was a persona, but it was also an outlet for the postmodern youth to deal with the uncertainty of the times. The real world had 9/11 and economic recession, but online those things felt distant and manageable. You could even joke about them, which was strangely empowering because at least it meant you were acknowledging them. But this era of social media was not long for this world. MySpace began to cannibalize itself due to its increasingly awful UI, spam, and security issues. Competitors like Facebook and Instagram, with their clean, uniform interfaces and professional auras, became the new norm. But make no mistake, these sites, despite their clean and curated vibe, are still postmodern. People may not be LARPing on Instagram, but they're still projecting personas, idealized versions of themselves that we begin to relate to and value more than the actual human behind the screen. Instagram still exists in hyperreality, it's just at a more advanced stage of postmodernism. The key to this progression, of course, being money. Social media is far past its humble origins of just being a tool for connection. Today, it's the backbone of advertising. For the silent generation, it was the radio, for boomers and Gen X, the TV, and for us, it's social media, and by extension, influencers. Corporations know people don't trust them, so instead of selling your product yourself, why not just get someone else to do it for you? Specifically, someone trusted by a large following that just so happened to be your target audience. Previously, this was pretty much just limited to celebrities, but with social media, everyone now has a platform to influence others and get them to buy stuff. So in this way, it's democratized the playing field for ad revenue, which I think is a good thing. But the downside is that now regular people had become a part of corporations' marketing strategies. Consumers had distrusted corporations for decades, but now who could you trust? How do you know if someone is being authentic or just trying to sell you something? This was the reason for postmodernity's decline. This is why everyone hates social media these days. It just feels like a lesser imitation of the human connection that we crave. But if that's the case, then why do people still use it? Everyone knows social media is fake, yet everyone also seems to follow people that they deem as the exception to that. What makes them not part of the machine, so to speak? The answer lies in a cultural shift that's been happening over the past few years, a repulsion for everything corporate and manufactured, and a craving for authentic vulnerability. We can't just ignore our problems. The world really can be a dark place. But maybe we don't have to pretend everything's fine either. Maybe we can learn to live with the uncertainty, to carry the weight and still move forward, to show our truest selves to the world, warts and all. And so, Metamodernism was born. In ancient Greek, the prefix meta generally referred to notions of between or beyond, and in that way, Metamodernism seeks to bridge the gap between modernism and postmodernism. It oscillates between the two, between hope and melancholy, naivete and knowingness, empathy and apathy. It doesn't dismiss fears or negative emotions like modernism might, but it also doesn't give in to nihilism as postmodernism is prone to. In practice, metamodernism has a really distinct feeling in the media that it's in, a weird mix of playful irony and cheeky self-awareness that still recognizes the human struggle. Wes Anderson's Fantastic Mr. Fox is a classic example and also just a great movie. The film walks a delicate emotional tightrope between sincerity and detachment. On one hand, the characters all deal with their own insecurities and internal conflicts, but the film's tone never dips into bleakness. On the other, even during the happiest moments, there's a constant undercurrent of poignancy. Throw in plenty of self-referential jokes and fourth wall breaks, and you have a textbook meta-modern film. I'm not going to spoil it as I absolutely think it's worth watching, but if you've seen the film, you know exactly what I'm talking about. But since you can't really spoil a song, I'm going to give you a track that I think is meta-modern. Might be a hot take, but I think Sum 41's Walking Disaster is unintentionally meta. Throughout most of its playtime, it's a typical pop-punk postmodern track, with our disenfranchised narrator rebelling against his parents. Virtually every line signals a loss of innocence and a progression towards nihilism. But what I think elevates this song and why I still listen to it past my teenage years is the ending. The narrator acknowledges that flawed as they are, his parents are family and the most important people in his life. In these final 25 seconds, we've not only oscillated from an apathetic, rebellious tone to a hopeful, empathetic one, but we've done it in a way that specifically acknowledges this shift by mirroring the intro. It's as if the song is saying, yeah, life sucks and nothing really matters, which is why it matters so much. Themes like these are becoming increasingly prevalent in art, music, and cinema, but it seemed to lag behind in penetrating social media. That is, until 2018 with the release of TikTok. Regardless of where you stand on it, the fact is that TikTok's rise has been historic. In less than a decade, it's become one of the world's top social media platforms and is an integral part of pop culture. Songs that go viral on the app inevitably soar on music billboards, for example. Despite the space being dominated by big players like Facebook and Instagram, it managed to carve out a niche for itself by appealing to Gen Z. In the US, roughly 2/3 of the app user base are between the ages of 13 and 27. No other social media platforms comes close in terms of Zoomer concentration. But why do Gen Z like TikTok so much? Well, some sociologists have labeled them as the generation of metamodernism. They're the first digital natives, growing up with constant access to internet and social media, and as a result, constant access to internet personas and unrealistic standards. Growing up in a world so saturated with artificiality has led them to put a premium on authenticity. This is where TikTok came in comparison with Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn, which are seen as performative expressions of one's public image. TikTok is different. It's edgy and chaotic, kind of reminiscent of early MySpace. And this vibe is actually rooted in something tangible, the algorithm. In addition to popularizing the now universal short-form content, TikTok's For You page has an uncanny ability to deliver hyper-relevant content. Unlike most platforms which primarily push already famous creators, TikTok emphasizes engagement. So long as a video resonates, it doesn't matter how many followers the creator has. This means that even the most niche, ridiculous garbage can successfully find its target audience. And because of that, it feels more personalized, like every video is made by a friend rather than a celebrity. Which is important because Gen Z doesn't want professional. Professional implies curated and corporate. What Gen Z wants is relatability and ruggedness. TikTok's grassroots algorithm allows regular people to be seen just by being themselves. This revolutionized social media. Never before had regular people been so empowered to create content that really resonated with others. And to really see how dramatic this shift was, we need to take a quick detour and understand gym culture. Also, just a heads up, there's going to be a ton of shirtless dudes in this section, so be warned. Throughout my life, fitness and weightlifting have been some of my biggest hobbies, and while I never had a big social media presence, I've maintained a distant finger on the pulse on the fitness industry and some of its biggest players. When I was growing up, those were guys like David Lade and Jeff Sed, pioneers of the early fitness influencer space. They laid the blueprint for what a typical mainstream Gymshark athlete would look like: insanely ripped, chiseled jawlines, handsome looks. They weren't massive like bodybuilders or strong like powerlifters, they were just aesthetic. And it worked out for them. Both became extremely successful and influential in the industry. So successful, in fact, they spawned an entire generation of these aesthetic influencers. Everything about their lifestyle was picturesque: their physiques, their looks, their cars, their girlfriends. Every guy wanted to be them, every girl wanted to be with them. And with a discount code in hand, who wouldn't shell out for a chance to look like them? This was the mainstream fitness industry throughout most of social media's existence. That is, until 2023, when a 20-year-old kid from Ohio started posting videos of his workouts to YouTube. That kid, of course, being Sam Sulek. Regardless of how plugged in you are to the gym scene, I'm sure many of you have heard of him. His growth in popularity has been meteoric. After uploading his first video in January 2023, he ended the year with over 3 million subscribers and a string of brand deals that made him a millionaire by 21. In 2024, The Guardian even called him the current king of fitness influencers. And looking at him, it's easy to see why he stands out. He's an absolute tank of a human being. But this isn't actually why Sam got so popular. There's a ton of massive dudes online. Hell, most Mr. Olympias don't have anywhere near this level of popularity. What sets Sam apart is his content, which if you've ever seen his videos might seem odd at first, because measured by the typical content standards of the era, they suck. There's no quick jump cuts, no background music, no wacky sound effects. They're just raw, unedited footage of his workouts. They're incredibly slow-paced and reject all common wisdom of appealing to the dopamine-addicted, low-attention span masses. But the reason this content works is because of him. Despite being a massive individual, Sam's a really laid-back and chill guy. His content embodies that. It's a direct reflection of who he is as a human being. If he were to use the quirky, over-the-top content standards of today, his content would be lesser because of it. This was one of the defining shifts in the social media ethos. Seemingly overnight, the old vanguard of aesthetic influencers became seen as pompous and fake. People instead craved this low-production, authentic content. And not just in spite of its flaws, but because of them. It was in this embracing of ruggedness that we shifted from postmodernism to metamodernism. And now you can see it everywhere on social media. Low-key daily vlogs of simple living, people posting job loss updates on LinkedIn, no makeup selfies on Instagram. It's all part of the same trend, a collective hunger for something real. In my opinion, authenticity has become the most valuable currency on the internet. Social media was always about connecting with others, and this new generation seems to be doing that better than before. But in true metamodernist fashion, I'm going to oscillate here and acknowledge the downsides of the situation. Because while I do feel like there's more authenticity online than 10 years ago, that doesn't mean we're all singing kumbaya out here. There's still plenty of internet posturing and personas online. Social media hasn't completely transformed, no medium ever does. We've just increasingly shifted towards this new ethos over the past years. And just like before, metamodernism is not immune to being co-opted. The rise of authenticity is already starting to become commodified. I feel like you can already see it with this new wave of advertising. Ads that are framed to look like user content, but you check who made it and it's the company's account. Time will only tell how long this new wave lasts. Maybe we keep riding it, maybe we move on to super metamodernism or something, I don't know. But regardless of how it ends, you can be sure that it'll be the catalyst for the next generation and whatever the hell they're doing. That's all I have for you guys today. If you enjoyed it, you should totally like and subscribe, comment, all those things, and have a great day. And until next time.